Hi, welcome to this week's lecture where we're going to be talking about games and simulations in the history classroom. I'm going to change the order we normally do things, and I'm going to start with loads of activities, and then I'm going to go on and talk about the theoretical rationale that underpins this kind of approach. So in the first part of the lecture I'm just going to go through and share some ideas and strategies that you might use in the classroom. Some of these we've touched on in the previous lectures where I've been trying to illustrate an overall approach to history, but I thought it's useful to pull them together here and to explore them in relation to active, engaging, classroom-based approaches to teaching history. So I'm going to start with a bunch of quick games. The first one, odd one out, you can use in the classroom, is a really simple activity. For example, you introduce it by saying which is the odd one out between apple, banana, cabbage and orange. Clearly the answer is cabbage because it's the only vegetable. Then you can follow up with more historical examples. Which is the odd one out from Chief Minister, Monarch, Prime Minister, President? This is more complicated because in this example some students might say the President because Malaysia doesn't have one. Some people might say the Monarch because he's the only person who isn't elected. Other people might say Chief Minister because he's the only one that doesn't have a national role. So you can decide which sequences to show students. Some people will want to predetermine 4. Others will have a whole box of cards and they will pick them out slightly random. You can also decide if there's a right or wrong choice, or if it's just a game for students to, like this last one, to look for any connections they can make, and then you can test out the ability to which they come up with sensible suggestions. You can offer children the chance to put together their own sequences with cards, or to make up their own cards to test each other, and you can select keywords to reinforce memorization and to check understanding. So this is a quick a starter or a plenary at the end of a lesson kind of activity. It's a useful way to reinforce some key vocabulary that you want to keep running through a scheme of work, but it's also useful to give you a quick opportunity to check whether the children are coming up with reasonable answers, or whether they're coming up with outlandish ones, to check that they have a sensible understanding developing. So the second activity is drawing from memory. In this example we might split the class into groups of 4, number each student in each group with a number from 1 to 4. You call up the number ones to it to look at a picture that's on your desk, and then give them 20 seconds to study it. They're not allowed to write anything down, they're not allowed to draw anything at that stage. They go back to their table. The other children watch them while they draw as much as they can remember in a minute, and then you get the number 2s up to do the same thing, then the 3s, then the 4, and when each person has had a go at completing their composite picture on their table, then you can compare the final drawings. Now this is a fairly straightforward thing. You don't want to spend too much time on this because it is only getting them to really focus on the details of a picture, so it's not a learning activity in its own right. But the usefulness of this is that you can select a picture which includes plenty of details which are relevant to a topic. Here's a picture that came up on Google when I was searching for images related to Malaysian independence, and this is the ceremony that happened to mark independence. So clearly there's significance in the people who are there, there's significance in the social inequalities, there's significance in the size of the crowd that was there, and all sorts of other things that you might decide are particularly relevant to your teaching of the topic. So you can use this to introduce children to a topic. The discipline of having to look and go away and reproduce things helps the children to think about what are the most important features, so it makes them focus really closely and critically on the picture, because obviously they have to decide what's going on here and why each component they're going to go away and draw is important. And it's a useful way just to make them focus their attention, again probably at the beginning of a lesson in a starter activity that might only take 5 to 10 minutes as a total, but it's a nice fun way to introduce the topic and to get the children thinking about what are the themes that are going to be unfolding in this lesson. Storytelling, another quick game which is very similar in a sense to using the picture. Here we split the students into 3 again. We give each student a number. This time you probably need another adult to help you manage the classroom. You take the number 1s to a quiet spot or out into the corridor, and you tell them a story that you've prepared about the period you're studying, and you make sure that story includes all the details that you think are important and all the themes that you want to pick up later in your teaching. Then you ask the students to retell the story in as much detail as they can remember to the people who have been labelled number 2 in their team, and then the number 2s tell the number 3s what the story is, and then you ask the number 3s to share what they now understand about the story. And then in a class debrief, you can ask them what they remembered, what they found easy to remember, what facts seem to slip through their memories, and why are certain things easier to remember than others. This is useful as an introductory activity. It's a good idea if you pick confident children to have the third role, because they need to stand up and be prepared to give imperfect answers in the class, so you don't want people who are going to be too readily embarrassed. The debrief enables you to talk about not just the content of the story, but the strategies people use to remember important facts, and that can be useful as a little kind of message to reiterate in the history classroom. And also, of course, because people are remembering some things as being more important than others, it introduces the concept of historical significance to the discussion. Another quick game, this time using a picture again, is a freeze frame. So in this example, this is a picture of a Victorian working class family. We might ask the children to organise themselves to reproduce the picture in front of the rest of the class. Each child adopts a role and they kind of reenact the image, and then they can take 5 minutes to think about how they would feel in that role. Using what historical knowledge they have, they can talk about what their positions are in this picture and why they're in those positions and what the background story might be to their characters, and then others in the class can use those 5 preparatory minutes to come up with questions to ask each character. So it's useful to pick a picture which includes themes which are relevant to topics. So this one would be obviously really useful to look at themes of large families during the Victorian era, the poor housing conditions, and poverty. And the fact that father was looking fairly desperate might lead you to think about the unpredictability of employment for people in the working classes as well. So this would be a really rich image to spend 10 minutes focusing on in class. The active engagement functions as a really useful way again to focus children's attention on the details. Because you've selected this because it illustrates certain themes which are important to you, then it enables them to focus on those themes as well. The drawback is that you'd really have to take care to identify potential inaccuracies that emerge, because if you've got children who are effectively making up stories in response to this picture, you need to differentiate clearly between what's an accurate portrayal, what we are just developing as a fictional response to a picture. And probably the most useful way to use this kind of activity is to note on the board significant questions, significant possible interpretations, and then these might be stored for useful historical questions to use in subsequent activities and lessons. Another quick game that might just take 10-15 minutes is sloganeering. Once you've studied a group of people in history, you can put children into groups and ask them to devise a slogan or a logo for that particular group of people. So depending where you put this in a sequence of work, they might already know a lot of the background history, in which case this is just a summary activity, or you might give them a little pack of resources to use so they can use the information, statistics, leaflets, photographs, etc. to draw out key messages that would inform their slogan. This is an example maybe from someone who'd been studying the American New Deal, coming up with some kind of strategy to demonstrate the importance of agriculture and the importance of making sure that agricultural workers are paid to work, because that will feed into future prosperity. So this idea that the government would invest to keep people employed, to keep the economy back, or to get the economy back on its toes. So this is a useful, quick activity to check that students have interpreted the evidence in realistic ways, and it provides a nice sense of novelty for students, and it encourages them to work collaboratively and to review each other's work. Quick game 6 is about finding connections between facts. So you can give students 4 cards, each with a different keyword on, and they all relate to a central concept, and then ask them to connect them up, either through providing a verbal explanation to the rest of the class, or through providing a mind map diagram and then annotating the connections. So here's an example. The key concept could be socialism, and you give children the words workers, nationalism, unions and equality, and you ask them to connect them up so that all the words are connected together and connected to the concept, and then they label the connections to make sure that they've understood how socialism is linked to these other key ideas. Next example, revolution, gives you another example of how you might do this, and you could do this with any topic you're teaching. So the advantage of this is that using diagrams helps pupils to see the connections between ideas, and that helps them to build up a sense of how they could construct explanations by thinking about the nature of those connections. Using group work for this kind of activity helps students to try out different types of explanation on each other before they commit an explanation to paper. And using groups also enables students to share prior knowledge about those key words. So that this is a useful kind of peer learning activity as well. The seventh quick game we're going to mention is historical dilemmas. So the teacher could summarise a scenario and ask children to devise a possible solution, and then test out their answers on other groups to get feedback on possible advantages and problems. As pupils share their ideas, you can encourage others to ask questions from different group perspectives. So if we're doing this, let's say for example you could outline the impact of the Japanese invasion, and then say, well, if you had if you were suffering at the hands of the Japanese, what would you do in the next 5 years? If on the other hand you were collaborating with the Japanese and doing fairly well out of it, what might you do in the next 5 years? So you can make this activity easier or more difficult by giving the children more or less details and that they have to incorporate in their reasoning. Obviously, the fewer details you give them, in a sense, the more free they are to come up with fictional responses. The more you give them specific historical detail, the more challenged they are to come up with solutions that take account of those details. You can also assign different groups different perspectives to represent, so that their questioning and their solution finding takes on a much more sharply focused agenda from different groups in history. And this would function as a good pre-teaching activity to ensure students have thought about a topic in advance of more detailed study. So by setting the scene with a dilemma, encouraging them to predict things that might realistically happen, you create a nice framework within which they can encounter the more detailed knowledge later on in the scheme of work. Another quick game might be called Your Turn. This is a very easy but slightly different way to approach a little reading task. So instead of just taking it in turns to read a text out, or the teacher reading a text to the whole class, take it in turns. So start with person 1, who reads the first sentence. Person 2 doesn't read anything, but they have to respond by thinking on their feet to the first sentence, by either sharing a comment or a thought or posing a question in relation to that. Then the next person reads the next sentence, the next person along shares their response, then person 5 reads the next sentence, and this carries on until you've finished the reading. So you have to choose a relatively short and focused text, because if it goes on too long it gets boring. And obviously the text has to be sufficiently interesting for there to be a response to each sentence that's read. This works well again as a nice quick starter activity to introduce a bunch of themes and questions for the rest of the lesson. You could repeat the activity twice, especially if it's a challenging piece of text to read, to see if the children have different interpretations, can come up with different comments or questions. It's useful to keep it fairly short because you want to keep it fairly pacey. You want to keep the speed up so that it stays interesting and engaging. This also is useful because it introduces children not just to reading aloud, but to critical reading, so that as they read it, they're constantly thinking about what it means and they're constantly striving for an interpretation of the source. Quick game 9, questions. Provide a new short text, as with the last activity, but just give it to students and ask them to come up with questions that they either want to ask of you, or of the source, or of people in the classroom, and then use those questions to focus the remainder of the lesson. So you can use the questions to collect in and plan subsequent lessons in your scheme of work, or you could just reallocate those questions to students so that when they read the textbook, they're reading to look for the answers to the questions they've identified as being interesting. Or you can give the students the questions and ask them to bundle them up so they look for connections. If they might find a whole bunch of questions that are to do with the economy or to do with political power, for example, and then they could be exploring the themes that connect the questions. And then final quick game that I'm going to mention, 3 points. If you're reading a new text, allocate it to small groups and just ask the small groups to come up with the most important 3 points that would summarise the information, and then get them to compare the group summaries and think about whose is best. So you need to pick readings carefully to make sure they're short and they are focused. Give the students a time limit so this doesn't drag on. It's another useful starter activity. Ask students to identify the best summary and talk about why it's better than the others. And this really helps again to focus just beyond reading aloud to the class, but focus on the interpretation of sources and information, and to encourage students to think about the main ideas. That's something which adults take for granted, but younger students often find quite difficult. They might read a text quite fluently, but find it difficult to identify what are the really key significant concepts and ideas that lie at the root of that. So this is a useful opportunity to get them to test out their skills of interpretation and critical reading, and gives you a useful bit of feedback to find out who's really grasping the topic. So other things we might do, we might design board games. So a really useful revision tool is at the end of a topic, just ask the students, imagine you were designing a board game for another group of students who haven't yet studied this topic. What would you do, and how would you create a game that would be educational for those children? So that's a really useful way for you to check that they've understood the content, to give them an opportunity to go back and rehearse some of that content and to identify what seems to be most important to them. So reproducing their learning as a board game is a useful way to consolidate their understanding, and a useful way for you to check what they're picking out as important learning. But you can, as a teacher, also divide your own board games. So here's an example of one that I devised. Snakes and Ladders is a very commonly played game. You normally just roll a dice and you move along. If you land on a ladder, you go up. If you land on a snake, you slide back down, and the first person to the top of the board is a winner. Is a slight variation on that, and this was devised to teach children about medieval beliefs about heaven and hell. So students play it as normal Snakes and Ladders with a dice, but when they land on a question mark, they have to pick a chance card. Some of the cards move you forward and some move you back. So here are some examples of cards that I wrote to accompany this activity, and it really, each card just demonstrates one way in which the church was important in the lives of medieval people in Europe. And so as the children go through and collect the cards, they're just being introduced in a fun and light-hearted way to some of the themes that we're going to pick up in our later teaching when we teach about the church in more detail. Here's another example. I've used this with a whole range of topics in history, especially useful where there are lots of details or where we need to learn about different aspects of history. So for example, this is learning about medieval castle building. The board is on the right hand side, so everyone plays on this board. Each square includes one feature of a castle, and there are two types of castle. So over there, what I've labelled blue and pink. At the top, these are Motte and Bailey castles, and at the bottom, Norman stone keep castles. And the Motte and Bailey ones were built with wood on top of man-made hills, and the hill was the biggest defensive feature, and then bit by bit they were replaced by the hardier, more defensive stone versions. So this was one of the ways in which the Norman invasion of Britain consolidated their rule, by building sturdier, stronger castles that were more difficult to attack. So in this example, children just place the cards, they take it in turns, and here's an example of a game that's been played. You can see the blue person has got 4 in a row, so they win a point. But the key thing is the blue person has both types of castles, so the game involves just having to place the right descriptor card on top of the right characteristic. So you know, if the board says only temporary, then you have to put a Motte and Bailey castle on top of it, because it was made of wood and it could be dismantled very easily if you decided to move on. Whereas if you spent years building a stone castle, then clearly it wasn't temporary because it was there for centuries to come. Now you can do this with, I've used this when looking at political parties, so you can have different board comments that describe different aspects of political parties, and then ask children to put down communist or Nazi cards so that they can just check that they've really understood the difference between them. You can do this with periods of time. You can do it with all sorts of different ways of classifying information. I tend to use this as a revision tool before we move on and use the terminology to make sure that everyone's pretty clear on what to do. And the game only lasts probably 10 or 15 minutes, and the children are checking each other's accuracy as they go, and they can put their hand up and ask you if they're confused about whether their friend got it right or wrong. So again, useful just as a quick consolidation and revision activity. Now, moving into slightly more active forms of games and simulations, lots of history teachers use role play. There are at least two ways in which we can think about role play. The fairly minimal approach is hot seating a character. So in the picture you can see the teacher is taking on the character. In this example she's taking on the famous nurse Florence Nightingale. The person in the hot seat can be a teacher or a pupil though, and sometimes it's more fun if different people can take turns. So if it looks like the person in the hot seat is struggling to give an answer, or a child in the audience could give a better answer, then they can come up and tap the hot seat person and change places with them. And this is really useful for setting someone up to be interviewed by the audience, and I've used this as a useful way to get children to think about the importance of historical characters. So I've got into role to play a historical character, and their job is to come up with questions. They quite enjoy it because they try and come up with questions that you can't answer, so they see it as a bit of a challenge to catch you out as a teacher as well. But in the asking of the questions, they're really thinking about relevant background information that make the questions meaningful. The more advanced form of role play is that everyone plays a role, and we go into into a deeper kind of simulation with everyone playing different characters. This is another example from a primary school where people are playing medieval characters. This is a good way to check understanding and to ensure that children understand the different perspectives that are that mark out different people's experiences in society. And it's useful because role play focuses on different people encountering one another in specific social situations rather than just focusing on an individual. Now, sometimes this kind of spills over into thinking about simulations. Simulations can be as simple as posing a problem. For example, what would you do in this situation if you were this person, and getting people to predict. There are also increasingly sophisticated computer-based simulations. There's one example of a website here where you can read about simulations and look at reviews of different games that could be used in the history classroom. But also, as with the board games, you can devise simple games that replicate social processes. So here's another example. These are resources I developed for teaching about a year in the life of a peasant in medieval Europe. So each of the shapes on the left are cut out of card, and then you put a pencil through the middle and you spin the card, and then it lands on one side. So you can see you go through the year: spring, summer, autumn, winter. You can see I've highlighted where the spinner might land. If the one that's highlighted here tells you that your land is stony and it's difficult to plough, so you just get 5 baskets, whereas if your son's helped you do a great job, then you'd gain 20 baskets. So as people spin, it's completely down to luck, but as they spin, they see that you could have good luck or bad luck, and you can see that the farmer can have more or less food as a result of what happens in each season. In this example, at the end in the winter, a fire broke out and the farmer lost all of their baskets of corn. So they keep a tally on the scorecard as they go through. You can see through the year they're building up baskets of corn, and then this one disaster befalls them and they don't have any food. And then towards the end, we build up towards questions: is there anyone that doesn't have enough food in the winter, and what do you think would happen in the village now? This goes beyond just kind of playing a game and having chance things happen to you. Almost invariably the children start to think about, well, what would happen in a medieval village if you lost all of your corn? Would people just sit by and watch you starve as a neighbour, or would there be some mechanism to help you out? Which normally leads them to think about how neighbours might help each other out, whether there were local forms of charity. Sometimes they think about the role the church might play in helping out poor people in a parish. So this opens up a whole range of possibilities, but it's only by giving the children a stake in this that children are driven to really think about what life would be like in a medieval village if you didn't have enough food. So the simulation is useful because it just gives children an individual motivation for asking questions about life in society. So that's all I want to say about the kinds of activities that you might use. Hopefully it just gives you a flavour of the range of things that people have talked about in the world of history education. A really useful website I would recommend you to go and look at is collaborativelearning.org, and here's the page that leads you to their activities section. There's a whole series of pages that have history topics split into different units. So before you go on to look at the second lecture, where we will explain some of the theories and rationales that underpin this kind of teaching approach, I would recommend you have a little look around and see if you can find a couple of activities that are appealing to you that you might adapt. And when you look at these resources, you're looking at two things. You can look for interesting ideas and activities that you could just pick up and use as they are, but also look for the underlying structure. As I've tried to indicate, any game or board game that you devise could probably be reused in relation to different historical content. So have a look at what this website offers you and think about whether there are obvious games or card sorting activities that you could just adapt by replacing the different content but using the same activity structure. So here are a couple of the references I've drawn on for some of the ideas I've discussed today. Once you've had a look at that website, Collaborative Learning, come back and have a look at part 2 of this week's lecture, and we'll look at some of the reasons why this kind of teaching can be seen as relatively useful and successful in the classroom.